Okay, it's recording.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and for me that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So the seminar we're going to hear today has been organised by us, the ASP Climate Group, and at the moment it's 5 members. It's Coralie Boulay is not here at the moment, Lisa Jones, Tori Jonsdottir and Andreas Stroehlein and myself, Lee Yo. So we've been meeting for a few months now, and obviously our focus is on climate change. And that includes ideas on how to lower our own carbon footprints and also increasing awareness of the effects of climate change, of course, especially within the world of science and parasitology. If anyone else is interested in joining our group, please just let us know, and we'd love to have you on board, and just get in contact with one of us and we'll give you some more details. So this is the second seminar we've organised, and the first addressed how individual labs can increase their sustainability. And the recording is still available, so just contact Lisa for that link if you're interested. Today we'll be hearing from Andreas. He's a postdoc in Robin Gass's lab, working with Neil Young as a supervisor. Andreas studies parasitic worms of socioeconomic importance. It's those that affect livestock and humans. And he works in computational biology and bioinformatics. So that includes things such as gene curation, protein annotation, predictions of essential genes and drug targets, and he's recently been focusing on long-read sequencing technology. So just to let you know, this is being recorded, so if anyone's still got it on, just please turn off your microphone and video. Once Andreas has finished talking, we'll stop recording, and that'll allow people to ask questions without being incriminated. And you can also ask them in the chat if you like. Great, so over to you, please, Andreas.
Thank you for the introduction, Lee. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, and I want to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So as you may have heard from Lee's introduction, my area of research is quite specialized, and I have a feeling that is the case for most people in attendance today. So many of us will work on a very specific group of parasites, one particular parasite, a molecular system within a parasite, a specific group of proteins, or even a specific molecule within a parasite. So it may seem odd at first to see an immediate connection between parasites and climate change, between the outside world and the environment and an organism that lives at the expense of another one. So before I start, I just wanted to say that the topic of parasitism and climate change is not my own area of research. So that scenario that I just described regarding very focused specific area of parasitology, that's very much me. But as Lee said, I am part of the ASP Climate Focus group because I think we have a responsibility for safeguarding our planet and environment for future generations. And also, as we will see today, because climate change very directly affects the discipline of parasitology. And I hope this group and today's session will actually help to start a conversation about this topic. So today's session won't be about my own research. I'm not an expert in the area of climate change research. I was simply interested in this topic and I put my hand up to give an overview of it as part of this climate focus group. And so I started reading a bit about it. And in the process of doing that, I realized that there's a lot of work going on in this area. And at the same time, that there are a lot of problems that remain unresolved and a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So in this talk today, I just want to touch a bit on this a series of topics and subject areas that I came across during my literature research and thought were quite interesting or were fascinating or were even confusing. And so I hope that maybe this short introduction to the topic will lead to more of a fruitful discussion down the track, either among ASP members following this presentation or just down the track in general. So no parasite talk is a good talk without a life cycle as the first slide, right? But today I don't want to focus on a specific parasite at all that I work on or that others work on. I think there will be future seminars with opportunities to do that. I just want to go back to some of the very principles of parasitism. So I put together this schematic life cycle of a few parasites and a few hosts and a few intermediate host vectors. And what I really wanted to show you is that these parasites are very different in shape, in the size, in the way they live, if they have intermediate hosts or not, which of them they use and how they use them as their respective host. And the same goes for the host themselves. They're all very different. They have very different habitats, very different shapes and sizes and different life histories. So in order for these incredibly complex life cycle to succeed, a lot of factors have to be right and have to be aligned. And there are a lot of things for a parasite that have to be right for everything to go well and for the parasite to actually survive and succeed. So both the parasite and the host need to be at the right place, at the right time, with the right environmental conditions, such as temperature and humidity and so on. And that, of course, all depends on how the parasite is transmitted, how narrow of an ecological niche it inhabits, and how easily it can adapt to suboptimal conditions. And as for parasitologists, some of the parasites are very specialized in what they do, and others they're more generalists and can maybe do with a wider set of hosts or a wider set of conditions. So we can see very quickly how incredibly complex these networks of interactions between the different players in this network can get, and that parasites really act as connectors to entire ecosystems. And if you then have a think about how many parasites there actually are in the world, then their role in such ecological networks becomes even more important or even more clear. So there are some estimates that say that up to 70% of animal species are parasitic. So that means for every animal that is non-parasitic, there will be on average more than 2 other animals that are parasitic. And that doesn't even include the non-metazoan parasites. So the number is probably even higher. So parasitism seems to have proven as a very, very successful life strategy throughout evolution. And although that seems to be the case, as we can see, a lot of things still need to be right for parasitism to be successful. And I think we can understand that seeing this complex network, how a very, very small disruption to the system might have a very big impact to the system as a whole and could potentially have quite severe knock-on effects. And such disruptions, they may be desirable because it's beneficial for the parasite, or they may backfire completely and be of disadvantage to the parasite. But today I don't really want to talk about chaos theory or butterflies. So let's talk about climate change. But this idea of small disruptions to ecosystems that potentially lead to big either advantageous or detrimental effects, I want you to keep that idea in mind for later. So what are some of the disruptions that we're facing in the context of climate change? Well, perhaps the most obvious one is the increase in mean surface temperature of the Earth. So and that leads to melting of the ice caps and an overall rise in sea levels. But it's not only getting warmer and warmer overall, the variability in climate change is also increasing. And that leads to more and more extreme weather events such as severe storms, extreme heat events and fires, heavy rainfall events and flooding, as well as prolonged periods of drought. And humans, of course, also play a big role in creating disruptions. So for example, through migration that are forced by conflicts, by wars, by hunger, by civil unrest, or the loss of habitable areas. And the world population is growing overall as well. And that leads, of course, to expansions into new habitats and new ecosystems. So that obviously creates disruptions as well. And then globalization leads to increased international trade and travel. So that presents opportunities for the spread of parasites over longer distances. And disruptions such as deforestation, for example, they of course destroy or put out of balance previously untouched ecosystems. So then it also looks like that some parasites themselves are actually creating a sort of a feedback loop of disruption by directly contributing to climate change. So there's a recent study published in IJP that estimates that a higher parasite load in ruminants can actually lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions by the host of up to a third. So it looks like that effective parasite control may actually be a way of mitigating emissions created by livestock. But now we're already talking about parasite control, and I just wanted to go back to the schematic life cycle for a second. So we know parasite life cycles are really complex, we know they're really fine-tuned, and we've seen the amount of disruption that are caused either directly or indirectly by climate change. So for a parasite to survive and succeed, all of those disruptions, they really need to be dealt with. And the host at the same time are also dealing with the same or similar disruptions. So you can see how the whole process becomes really, really highly dynamic and very complex very quickly. So now I just want to have a bit of a closer look with you at the positive and negative disruptions to parasites and hosts that can occur, and which consequences these disruptions might have, and how drastically they will impact the parasite, the host, and their interactions together, and then look at some potential mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies that the parasite and the host might employ. So on the parasite side, the usual definitive or intermediate hosts, they may have been dispersed or gone extinct, which of course leads to disruptions of complex life cycles, or new potential hosts may have been introduced in an area, and whether a parasite can use these changes to its advantage really depends on a lot on its ecological niche. So whether it's been quite loosely defined or whether it relies on a very narrow set of conditions and hosts. And on the host side, changes in population density, as well as direct physical changes, such as temperature and humidity, may of course lead to changes in behavior, movement, and the distribution of the host. So in the most severe cases, those disruptions can actually make an environment inhabitable for either the host or the parasite, which then can lead to extinction, or so-called co-extinction, where the reliance on the host that has gone extinct or has been removed from the environment leads to extinction of the associated parasite. And in other cases, we might see new parasite and host pairings that may emerge when the spatial and physical conditions have made such a pairing possible. For others, these disruptions do not represent as bad of a disadvantage that they lead to extinction, but potentially they will lead to just a shift in hosts, a shift in location, or lead to habitat loss or a decrease in population growth. So now there are a number of different ways of how both the parasite and the host might be able to adapt to those consequences and to those impacts. So let's have a look at the parasite first. For the parasite, it could happen by finding new habitats, new suitable hosts, reducing the length or complexity of its life cycle, making a change to reproductive rates, or even switching to reliance on asexual reproduction only. For the host, adaptive processes could include things like changes in behavior, direct physiological changes, changes to how the immune system balances both novel and lost stressors, and of course changes to the habitat itself by migrating or dispersing into other areas. And perhaps one of the areas of most concern is the emergence or re-emergence of novel parasites. And I think after what we've been through last year, there's very little doubt that there's an increased risk for such events to happen and for them to happen more frequently in the future. So Coralie has made this really nice slide here, so I'm using it. And I think it's quite mosquito specific, but I think it serves as a good example of the potential consequences of climate change for vector-borne diseases. So a change in vector distribution might lead to expansion of parasites into new areas where people live that don't have immunity against these novel parasites. Events such as floodings may create new or more favorable habitats or breeding grounds, and they may increase the likelihood of humans to get actually into contact with infectious stages of the parasite. And then, of course, some of the effects of climate change lead to socioeconomic disruptions such as poverty, and that indirectly can favor the spread of parasites by just not allowing for adequate prevention or treatment regimens. And of course, conflicts, food insecurity, and poverty all lead to increased movement of populations. So that will lead to an increase in the dispersal and spread of parasites, or move people into the habitat of novel pathogens. So there certainly is an increased risk for the emergence or re-emergence of novel pathogens. But something that I hadn't really considered an issue is the actual risk of parasite extinctions, and that conservation biology for parasites is actually something that will be necessary. Because in the context of climate change, we always talk about extinction of species, we talk about conservation, but for parasites, that's not really the case as much. And we'll see that we really should think about parasite conservation. So it's been suggested that about 5 to 10% of parasites will be extinct by 2070 due to climate-driven habitat loss alone. And that number is probably even higher when we include the risk of host-driven co-extinctions. So on this slide, I've listed a few sort of theoretical concepts of what determines whether a parasite will vanish or will succeed. And so first of all, it greatly depends on how well both the host and the parasite metabolism and physiology can adapt. And then something that I wasn't really aware of is that apparently the extinction of larger hosts increases the risks of co-extinctions because larger hosts tend to host larger number of very diverse but very specialized parasites. And of course, it also depends on the number and the persistence of individual life cycle stages for each parasites. So in theory, all of these impacts and disruptions and coping mechanisms, they all made sense to me. But I think one of the big questions for me was how we're actually able to measure these effects at a larger scale and how we're able to predict what will happen in the future. So I'm not going to go into detail of the methods to do these kind of analyses because they appear fairly complex. And as I said, I'm not an expert in ecological modeling or anything like that. But I just want to go over a few general ideas on how we can model parasite dynamics. So one of them is to look at population dynamics and model how different climate change parameters and different events might shift populations and what kind of imbalances could occur. So one of such events is a so-called bottleneck event, where a population decreases drastically both in size and in diversity. And upon recovering from such an event, then that creates opportunities for other novel parasites that then could end up becoming the dominant species in that population. Another method is to look at interaction networks or dependency networks. So in this case, the species that are most connected within such a network are likely to lead to the biggest disruption when they go extinct. And given that up to 80% of parasite species represent such links in food webs, we can estimate that the extinction of highly connected parasite species may actually lead to a series of quite drastic downstream effects within that network. So the question is how well both host and parasite can deal with the disruption to these networks and how well they can react, for example, to host extinction events or to dispersal events. And when we're trying to answer these questions, one of the key ideas is that of a generalist parasite versus a specialist parasite. So generalist parasites, they're capable of exploiting more than one, often several different host taxa, whereas specialists have co-adapted closely to one particular host and are dependent on or one or two phylogenetically closely related host taxa. And they will only develop and survive if they have these particular hosts available. So for a specialist, the risk of secondary extinction due to the host being extinct is certainly higher because they need to evolve to be able to colonize a new host, whereas a generalist is already able to do that. So that means parasite with high host specificity combined with a complex life cycle and a narrow climatic tolerance, they seem to be the ones that are at risk or at the highest risk of extinction. So to answer these questions, what really needs to happen are experiments that establish the physiological limits of a parasite species through the entire life cycle. And two indicators that may speak to the underlying adaptability and plasticity of parasites in general may be A, the difficulty with eradication of parasitic diseases that we have, and also the widespread development of resistance against drugs. So their overall success throughout history actually suggests that parasites are quite good at adapting to changing conditions. But to gain a better understanding of a parasite's resilience and adaptability, research in many other areas than just basic biology is needed. And that includes things like data on species distribution, the biodiversity and the genetic diversity of a parasite, phylogenetic studies, studies investigating host associations, and so on. And that's a huge task, but certainly one that's now being undertaken for more and more species and more species complexes. And this figure here is just an example from a recent paper that looks at these aspects for exotic ticks. And to do so, they actually sequenced almost 700 specimens. So that's a huge effort to undertake. And other efforts, they're taking a bit more of a holistic approach. And I just wanted to show you this, this resource that I found that I think is very cool. It's called PEARL, which stands for Parasite Extinction Assessment and Red List. And it's the world's first parasite conservation database. So this database holds more than 450 parasite species, or data on species distribution for 450 species. And their distribution projections under different future climate change scenarios. So on the website, you can just type in a species name or a species of interest, and you can see the conservation assessment information of that species under a particular scenario for any area in the world that you want. So for example, this slide shows the current distribution of the flatworm Schistosoma hematobium, which I work on, and it's shown in blue. And then now we can overlay this with a number of different climate change scenarios from very conservative to very drastic models. And so we can see what the predictions for expansion or contraction events of parasite distributions are for our species of interest. And so I would suggest to try it out for yourself and see if the predictions for your favorite parasite actually make sense to you as an expert. And if they don't make sense, maybe have a think about what the model is missing. So which information that as a specialist you have on a particular parasite or a particular life cycle stage of a parasite that is not included in the modeling. And of course, the other key factor determining the accuracy of such predictions is how many data points were available for a particular species. So certainly there's a sampling bias based on existing parasite collections and online data sets. But the creators of this resource actually make this quite transparent by showing the predictive power of their model, the likelihood of it being non-random, and the quality of the data, which is just the number of data points that they were able to collect, and the model uncertainty, which actually gives an estimate for the accuracy of the predicted boundaries on the map in kilometers. And finally, they also mention, of course, the source of the data points, so where they got it from, and a listing in the style of the IUCN red list that is used for many other animals. So in this case, we can see that the risk of extinction for the fluke Fasciola hepatica is of least concern, or LC. And so with this, I would actually like to come to the end of my presentation already. So for me personally, the research that I did for this presentation has really shown me that integrated and sustainable parasite management is about much more than just control and elimination. So these are kind of the obvious things that the obvious aspects that we consider and we think about. Many of us anyways that work on neglected or emerging infectious diseases, kind of like extinction, yes please, but only for there's parasite species that harm us or that are economically important, harm economically important host species. But I think we also need to consider things like surveillance and conservation efforts, given the importance of parasites in our ecosystems at large. So for those aspects, I think we really need to follow a more interdisciplinary approach, drawing from many other disciplines, including ecology, anthropology, climate change modeling, and of course, parasitology. And I think only by doing that, we'll be able to better understand parasite dynamics in our changing climate. So I guess the question for you all would now be, how can we achieve that? And what role should both the ASP and the field of parasitology as a whole play in these efforts? So hopefully this talk can serve as a bit of a primer for an ongoing and fruitful discussion on this topic in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks.